Hi, this is Stuart from the Planning Analytics team at IBM. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about file management in Planning Analytics Engine. Planning Analytics Engine is the database used in Cloud Pak for Data Planning Analytics 4.7 and higher, and the Planning Analytics SaaS offering on AWS that launched on January 31st, 2023. Because the database is being delivered as a service, there are significant changes to how we interact with files. We no longer have access to the file system that's part of the operating system that's hosting the Planning Analytics database. If you're familiar with the modeling workbench already, you may know that we have a file manager capability. So this file manager capability that we have, it exists in the modernized versions of Planning Analytics and the classic versions of Planning Analytics, which would be Planning Analytics on-premise and Planning Analytics on cloud. In the classic versions of Planning Analytics, though, this file manager uses something called the Planning Analytics Administration Agent to support uploading and downloading files to the TM1 version 11 database. In Planning Analytics Engine, this is a little bit different. We no longer have the Planning Analytics Administration Agent, but instead we have new API endpoints built directly into the database that can be used to do things like upload files, download files or delete directories, or even create directories. So being able to create directories or folders in here, that's something new. That's not something you're able to do with TM1 version 11, but it is fully supported with Planning Analytics Engine. You'll also notice in Planning Analytics Engine, we have a couple new directories that show up here. So when we create a database, by default, we're going to see these directories that start with the period, right? Some of these directories are used for things like holding backups. So when we use the API endpoint to back up a database, we see the backup files in here. We also have directories like the applications directory, which is used to hold web sheets, something we're probably all familiar with because it exists even in the classic versions of Planning Analytics, right? So here, through our sample database, we have a web sheet that exists within this directory, right? So the way we access files in the database is a little bit different. The way they're stored is also a little bit different as well. This file management area, it's baked into the database, right? So it's not based on an external file management system or something at the operating system level. Every one of these databases that we have has its own file management area, which is basically just part of the database at this point. Okay, so we also need to talk a little bit about how we interact with this file management area through Turbo Integrator processes. Because if we were to upload a file through here, of course, the next thing we'd likely want to do with that file is to consume it, or we'd want to do the same thing in reverse, where we're going to download a file from here, which has been created or generated by a Turbo Integrator process. So there are significant changes into some of our Turbo Integrator functions that are used to support this overall change to file management. The most basic or common one to deal with is ASCII output, right? So in this case, we're simply naming a file. The slash in front of the file is optional. If we don't use a slash, it's going to work all the same. But when we run this, what we're going to see is that it's going to generate a file called hello.csv. And if we download and examine this file, we'll see that the file contains the string hello world, right? With the slash, it's the same thing as well. Let's add the proper character in, and we'll try and run this. And in this case, we'll see, the same file exists, although if we examine the timestamp carefully, we might be able to see that the timestamp was slightly updated because the file was replaced. No different than the current TM1 version 11 behavior of replacing a file. If we want to place this file in a directory, we don't need to go through an additional step to create the directory first. We simply name the directory. So in this case, I'm naming a directory called A with the file in it. When we run this, and then we examine the file management area, we'll see that indeed it did create a directory called A, and that directory contains this hello.csv file. Right, so if we do this, and we can continue to do this with other directories as well, we could say, let's call this B, C, D, something like this. We'll save it, and we'll run this. Then when we examine our file manager, we see B. Inside directory B, there's a directory called C, D, and then finally the file. So all we have to do is name directories here as part of our ASCII output parameter value, and then our database will simply create those. Now let's say we wanted to delete a file. That's also fairly simple. We can use the existing ASCII delete function. We simply have to name the file that we want to delete. Right? So let's say we'll run this. And then when we examine the file manager, we'll see that the hello.csv file, which was in the root of our file management area of our database, has been deleted. Let's say we want to delete a whole directory. That is fairly straightforward as well. We simply name the directory. The only caveat, of course, is that the directory has to be empty first. So I'm going to run this. We'll execute this. And we'll examine the file management area, and we'll see that directory A still exists. And the reason it still exists, of course, because the hello.csv file is in the directory. But if I delete the file and I leave the directory, then I run this again. When we examine our file manager, we'll see that the directory has been removed. Now, let's say we wanted to recursively delete a directory and the contents in it. Like, we'll take the example that we already have with this B, C, D, and finally the file. If we just want to delete directory D, we can do that. I have a turbo integrator process that we'll provide as part of the blog post that has some code in here. We're simply going to name the directory here. So we'll put the directory as the parameter value. This code uses the wildcard file search function, turbo integrator function. So this function still exists. It just works against the file management area that's part of the database. And we can see that there's a bit of a trick in this turbo integrator process in that it basically checks to see if it actually did delete a file. If it did, it was a file. Otherwise, if it failed to delete it, right, we check for that right here, detecting that the file still exists. It's the same as the last file we tried to delete, at which point we can assume it's a directory. And then we recursively call the turbo integrator process with the subdirectory to be deleted. And we keep doing that until everything's deleted. So if we save this and then we run it and we say, yes, we're going to work against this /b directory. Once it's done, we should examine our file manager. And if everything worked perfectly, which it did, it deleted the contents of the directory and then finally the directory itself, including any subdirectories and files. Right, so that's just a very quick overview of the file management changes in Planning Analytics Engine using ASCII output ASCII to delete to manipulate files. One other change I'll just mention really quick, which is relevant to this, is there is a turbo integrator function called load rules from file or rule load from file. Of course, that still works as well. The only difference, though, is with that turbo integrator function, the file, of course, that you're loading the rules from does need to exist within this file management area. So no different than any other process. Okay, last topic we'll cover is just using files as data sources, right? So very simply, let's create a file here, and we'll create it in the same kind of complex directory just by running this process again. And then we'll create an all new process. So when we look at our data sources here, right, we have a file data source. There's also a location data source, which is a new data source type, although under the covers, location and file, really, it's no different. Both of these are a CSV file. It's just this is a CSV on a web resource, and this is intended to be a CSV in the file management area of the database. So we'll pick file here, and then we'll select the file. And notice that this brings up the same file management interface. And we'll go ahead and we'll pick our file, our hello CSV file. We'll select it. And then because it didn't have any headers, we'll make sure this is set to 0, and then we'll preview this. And then, of course, we can see the hello world, the single string that was put in this file. So we can see our turbo integrator process with a file data source works the same as before, although we're picking a file that exists within the file management area of the database, as opposed to a file that existed on the operating system or within the data directory that you may be familiar with in the past. So again, this has been Stuart, just with a quick overview of file management and Planning Analytics Engine. Feel free to leave your feedback, comments, questions. Always happy to answer questions about changes that are being made in Planning Analytics Engine for the Planning Analytics SaaS on AWS offering, or for Cloud Pak for Data, Planning Analytics 4.7 and higher. Thank you very much.